Out
please.
of 100 people, 4 will get the message.
In 1948, Winston Churchill said, "Those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it." And my conversation with today's guests makes me think that few of our leaders and policymakers are students of history. John Forrest Little is very much a student of history and anthropology. He brings some fascinating insights to what we're seeing today when it comes to political decisions, financial events, and human reactions. Now, you might not be familiar with John's work, but I highly recommend that you sit back and enjoy the interview as we cover everything from what the real inflation rate is through to how realistic it is that Bitcoin has a role as a currency. John has a knack of connecting the dots between history and what we're experiencing today, and as a result, we'd really be interested to hear your thoughts on his take on things. So please get in touch in the comments below or on Twitter to let us know what you think. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear more of our brilliant interviews. Just recently, we've spoken with Jim Rickards and Mark Faber, to name a few. But don't rush off just yet. Sit back for a little history lesson. John Forrest Little, welcome to GoldCore TV.
It's my honor to be here, Dave.
Thanks for joining us today, John. I'm really looking forward to this. Now, we've been warning on this channel for the last couple of years about the impending inflation problem that we're now seeing. We've also been talking about the idea of not believing the official narrative and also the challenges around official economic statistics and the problem with the monetary debasement, printing a fiat currency, the lack of sound money, and the increase in state control in our everyday lives. Now, you see this not only as evidence of an end of empire type situation, but you also see that there are a lot of clues from history that will show us how this might just play out. Can you explain that a bit for me?
Yeah, that's the perfect way to start this conversation, is to think of history in terms of eras. So 10,000 BC, there was the agrarian revolution, and that really changed the way people live. It almost domesticated the human animal from a hunter and gatherer to more sedentary, where people could store their grains in a barn or a silo. And the next big revolution was probably the Industrial Revolution. So there was in between those two eras, we've seen, major actors, whether it was during the Bronze Age with Athens or the Roman Empire. Then we saw the dominance of Spain, Portugal before Spain. Then, of course, England, the sun never sets on the English Empire. And now we're looking at sort of the US as the reserve currency. But in each of those cycles, there's always a big change, and the currency does get debased either two ways, usually by adding to the money supply or by introducing a base metal to the purity of silver, as was the case in Rome with the denarii. And the ruling class always distorts the official data. Once we went off the gold window in 71, that was quite a shocker. We've had shockers like, for instance, the Gold Confiscation Act under Roosevelt, under Roosevelt. Prior to that, Woodrow Wilson met with the Federal Reserve and established the Federal Reserve. At the Bank of England, the king wanted to go to war with France. So the king met with, I think, about 400 businessmen that loaned the money so they could go to war with France. And then they introduced these banknotes, and the private sector said, "We'll go ahead and loan you the money, but we want the monopoly on issuing the paper currency." So usually when you see this era where the US dollar is now worth maybe, let's say the purchasing power has been debased by about 98%. The lie is that inflation's only 9% or 8%. And I've done a lot of research that I think it's at 100%.
Yes, this is something I wanted to explore with you a little more. In fact, you sent over some charts that maybe we could bring up whilst you explain this. So why is it that you think that inflation is around 100%? I mean, that's quite a leap from the official figures, but it also sounds a little bit more plausible.
Some people say ShadowStat says 20, ShadowStat says 20. But if I have charts on what's happened to wheat, what's happened to soybeans, what's happened to corn, and that's been a doubling. Fertilizer's actually gone up 10 times. So I can argue that food in your belly double. Roof over your head, double. This is United States. I'm only speaking for the United States right now. Gas in your car, double. Heat for your home, double. Decatherm of natural gas in your part of the world is $30 per decatherm. We're at eight, which is a doubling. It was at 4 a year ago. So I think inflation's 100% and going higher. And this is a move, usually in history, to get us to wipe out the entire middle class.
And so this removal, if you will, of the middle class, how has that played out? Or more importantly, how is it playing out today?
Two-tier system. It's always been usually those that lived in the castle, which would be the feudalistic model, and the villagers working the fields. In Rome, it was the Senate held 99% of the wealth, and the hoi polloi, or the plebes, had 1%. But the rulers were kind enough to bless them with Colosseum games and a little bit of bread. And from that, we got the famous bread and circuses, which we're seeing in the United States. Netflix is our circuses, Hulu, the NFL, Major League Baseball, Taylor Swift, Justin Bieber, social media, every channel but yours. And I'm learning that the smaller channels like GoldCore, Palisades Radio, Arcadia Economics, they do such a better job versus these sort of like Kitco and Stansberry are turning into really like Bloomberg. They might as well just be MSNBC or Fox or CNN. No one's listening to them. So anyway, I wanted to say I'm thankful to be on your channel because you're more independent, thus less biased.
It's not something that is new. We're seeing that today. We're seeing, you believe, a distraction of the population. We're also seeing printing of paper money, of fiat currency, and we've seen this historically. We've seen the debasement of currency historically. So we've got the debasement of currency. We've got the idea of bread and circuses. These are tools, techniques, strategies that have been used by ruling classes for centuries. How do we join the dots between this and the collapse of fiat currency, the collapse of our monetary system, the collapse of what society is for us at the moment?
Yeah, I think the way you connect the dots is now we have to pivot probably away from a financial discussion and more into an anthropology or history lesson where we start, this is almost political science, which weaves the two, that the ruling class, there's two factors here. One's called legitimacy and the other is penetration. So as long as they're deemed as sort of being a benevolent or legitimate leader or a democracy of some kind, where the people do have input on sort of their autonomy, the ability to control your quality of life and control your own destiny, then there's legitimacy. But once that goes away, where we see acts of freakery in your part of the world, like with Boris, in our part of the world, there's Justin Trudeau taking trips everywhere, Hunter Biden taking the company plane, which is, to do business dealings with Ukraine and China, while meanwhile, the only reason we're getting relief at the pump right now is because our president released, 1 million barrels from the strategic reserves, and his son had brokered the deals. Likewise, Nancy Pelosi, well into her 80s, and all of the people in Congress using insider information to buy and sell stocks from Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing. They're getting intelligence briefings on, allegedly national security and using that to enrich themselves. So once the public sees these acts of corruption in full-on display, the ruling class stops even hiding it, then they've lost their legitimacy. So as far as connecting the dots, then people then start doing what they can to survive. If you see a train coming at you, you get off the track. If you see that the Fed is just printing, and we've seen this enormous printing effort just since the COVID lockdown started. And I'll argue those are also intentional. And next will be climate lockdowns. People then have to take control of, what can I do? It's like you and I and your viewers have to almost form a parallel universe that's outside the control of the political class that's actually trying to kill you, choking off the food supply in Netherlands, and debasing the money down to where it's lost 98% of its value is a way to kill people. They have less purchasing power, means that they're working for far less wages, because wages have not gone up really in real terms since the 70s in the US. I'm not sure about Europe, and for emerging markets, it's even worse because our political elites are in a sort of a cabal with political elites and corporate elites and military elites, basically just rape and pillage Africa and Latin America and South Asia, almost the entire Southern Hemisphere, with the exception of Australia, South Africa, and New Zealand, to exploit their natural resources and labor.
So exploitation and corruption of the ruling classes are also this kind of signs of an end of empire, of a destruction.
Right, and then the people have to rise up. But the problem is they're not. We're fighting little wars in the United States over school prayer, Roe versus Wade, what textbooks should be used, what statues are appropriate, what happened in Mar-a-Lago, gun control, lesbian, gay, transsexual, LGBTQ, RSTUV, WXYZ. And at that point, so we're involved in these class wars and taking our eye off the ball, which is the fact that our currency's been debased. Our rulers will always go to war. And that's when you looked at when Rome fell, or when Athens fell, or when Spain fell, or when British fell. It's always because the rulers always want to go to war, and we pay the bill. When Nixon went off the gold standard in 1971, it was to pay for Vietnam, Korea, and since then we've had Afghanistan, which we replaced the Taliban with the Taliban, and it was $3 trillion, 5 times the expense of Vietnam. And the US has been involved in 57 wars since World War II that our media has never said one word about, except for they talk a little bit about Iraq and Afghanistan and Vietnam, but what about the 54 others? It's a big problem.
In a conversation I had recently with Jim Rogers, he highlighted something that he couldn't remember who it was that they quoted, but that since the creation of the United States, there has been 15 years where the United States has not been at war with somebody.
The wars always lead to currency debasement. And why do nations go to war? More resource. In the case of Rome, they wanted the spices and the gold, always the gold and the oil, the spices and the labor. US has stolen more gold. We just stole gold from Ukraine in 2014. You can go online right now and just Google stolen gold in Iraq. Putin stealing Sudan's gold. And the more you think about the stolen, Mount Rushmore belonged sacred land for the Native Americans. And then we carved a bunch of, Anglo characters on their granite rock and stole their gold in the Black Hills of South Dakota. Pizarro stole the gold in the Inca Empire. Cortez stole the gold in Tenochtitlan, which was Mexico City. Which makes you think maybe gold's kind of valuable. We shouldn't steal it, but we should store. It's always watch what they do, not what they say. Because in mainstream media, all we hear is that gold and silver have zero value. They're ancient relics. They're rocks. They're yellow and shiny, but they have no value yet. Meanwhile, central banks are accumulating gold like you wouldn't believe. But what we need is a syndicate of common people accumulating gold, not the political class accumulating gold.
At what stage do you think that people start to do that? Because sentiment in gold and silver in particularly has been quite poor over the last while. So there is one in some parts of the world, in the Far East, in China, in India, and areas like that, there is a tradition of owning and holding and buying gold. There hasn't really been the same widespread tradition in Western economies. What stage or what has to happen for people to actually start to say, okay, I've had enough. I need to be owning gold and silver. I need to take something that is outside of the control of government, outside of the control of central bankers, and protect my wealth that way. Are we at or close to that point, do you think?
We're there now for two reasons. The first reason being, this will sound like a little primary, but gold and silver is the only financial instrument that has no counterparty risk on the other side of the trade. The other key factor is we've talked about these pattern shifts, and we're now seeing the rollout of the digital dollar throughout the world. And when that happens, people are going to be very nervous about the fact that the government has now control of facial recognition, GPS monitoring, and we're seeing it play out right now in China, where if your QR code turns the wrong color that day, you're basically a prisoner and a slave. Right. So do we want, and the ebbs and flows of history are that there are times when people go back to becoming slaves. We saw it with the killing fields when Pol Pot turned doctors, lawyers, craftsmen, everyone into working in the fields. You know, Stalin did the same thing. Russia was very advanced, and all of a sudden the people are starving. So people will want to get away from the digital dollar. They may use the new central bank digital currency for their mortgage or some big ticket items, but silver and gold are going to be used for all the ordinary trades up to, up to 5,000 or 6,000 or whatever the number that the Fed uses to say you can't do without them flagging the transaction. That number right now in the United States is as low as $600 or lower, maybe.
Wow.
eBay's sending out notifications if you sell, some pottery online. They want to track that. So people are waking up. It's John Little, Dave Morgan, Alistair McLeod, Palisades Radio. There's got to be a hell of a lot more of us than the 200,000 apes on Wall Street Silver. This needs to turn into the same, the Me Too movement. Hashtag Me Too shouldn't have more followers than hashtag gold or hashtag silver.
There was something that you said earlier, and it kind of echoes something I've heard you say before, which is the idea of our leaders and policymakers keeping the plebs distracted. And to put a real world example on it, with Boris Johnson, the UK Prime Minister, not too long ago, talking about how he can come across as a bumbling idiot a lot of the times. In a recent interview, he talked about going from gaffe to gaffe, and the idea of making gaffes all the time was a deliberate strategy that makes it more difficult to understand what the truth is. So this is the idea of keeping the media, and then by extension, the plebs, the general public, confused. So that when he actually wants to get something through, people can't tell whether he's serious about it or not. Now, thankfully, his reign as Prime Minister of the UK is rapidly coming to an end. But it's a very real example of what you're talking about, in case anybody thinks that a lot of these things sound conspiratorial. This is what they do.
Well, conspiratorial is one of those words that it's basically a conspiracy could be just the way thoughts are organized. Just because you see a pattern in something doesn't mean that you have to take it to catastrophize on that pattern. It's just when all of a sudden there's, I'll give you an example. If you look at confusion, the ordinary citizen would never be able to figure out US monetary system or the way our stock market works. You can pick any stock, Facebook, Apple, and Netflix, Exxon, and you have the face value of the stock, but then there's hundreds of thousands maybe of layers above the stock and below the stock where someone puts an option to put or a call option. And these are derivatives, which is just a financial instrument derived above the underlying asset. And that's why silver and gold are a joke in terms of the way it's priced in Western markets, which I call NATO, really. Either the LBMA or the Crimex here in the States, is why even worry what the paper price is? Because these derivatives, as Warren Buffett said here, are just, instruments of mass destruction. We talk about $30 trillion debt in the US and $300 trillion debt worldwide, but no one talks about the derivatives, which are in the quadrillions, and no one can even calculate them, because at night when the central banks start talking to each other and the swaps go back and forth, it's endless. And we saw this in 12th century Venice. They did the same thing to fund a war in Constantinople. Silver and gold's always vaulted, and then they issued paper bonds. Spain did the same. In the French language, I believe they're called, I can't remember, Spanish calls them juros, Juros. Everyone has a name for it. In the United States, they're called bonds. But they're usually paper, and that's what really hammered people from becoming independently sovereign to now a slave of the state. And we're seeing the surveillance in the United States now, where the Inflation Reduction Act, which started as Build Back Better, which got rejected based on the nomenclature. No one liked Build Back Better, but inflation being the number one problem in the US at the time, by saying inflation reduction, then that got passed. And Edward Bernays said it best. He was the father of propaganda in the United States, the nephew of Sigmund Freud. He said, all you have to do to confuse people is take the truth and then just add the opposite to it. So it's actually the Inflation Amplification Act that they're calling the Inflation Reduction Act, that has 87,000 new IRS agents.
Yes, I wanted to ask you about that and maybe explain that a bit more, because this really speaks to the idea of state overreach and increased state control. Explain this now, this aspect of it, the 87,000 IRS agents.
Well, that's classic. That's again, another end of empire thing. I would say Gestapo would be a really good analogy. In the East, China, what we're seeing right now with the people in white suits. Have you seen any of those videos of the people and they're almost like dog catchers, and they're in white suits with helmets. They even shock people. But if you think about the sheer number of 87,000 new feds, that would fill up the Rose Bowl. On their own website. So I always take people, there's an old saying here, it's someone tells you who they are, shows you who they are, believe them. And the recruitment ad, it was get ready to fight, shoot to kill. Meanwhile, our border patrol is not allowed to shoot to kill, and I don't want to comment on the border wall, because I really believe that there's a lot of problems in the world, and that's not one of them. But this is a big problem when you got the ruling class that's going to roll out this new Gestapo that are told that they're to shoot middle-class Americans, and the average audit's going to be on someone under $50,000 a year. The people that make north of $100,000 to $200,000 to $300,000 to $400,000 a year will hide behind inversions, shell companies, lawyers, accountants, set up corporations in the Cayman Islands, and I don't blame them for doing that, because the state and the apparatus of the state is your largest enemy here in the States.
Okay, so what role do you think that cryptocurrencies and the likes of Bitcoin will have in what's to come? Or do you think that it will have any role in what's to come?
Well, I think the philosophy of Bitcoin is astounding. From blockchain technology makes sense if you're trying to verify a ledger. If you and I had a title company, I would use blockchain because you can't alter it. It would save us from having to have hard copies of everyone's deeds. So for smart contracts and things like that, blockchain works. But as money, it's a horrible idea, because earlier we talked about counterparty risk. The largest counterparty risk as empires clamp down is to turn off the energy grid. We talked about choking off the food supply, rolling out, unleashing a virus, which everyone knows was through gain of research funding. And you can thank the United States for using the NIH and the EcoHealth Alliance to fund the gain of function virus in Wuhan. Everybody knows that. There's no conspiracy. You can Google it. So if the virus didn't work, if the climate lockdowns don't work, if the digital currency doesn't work, the last thing, turning off the power grid is pretty easy. So why would you want to store? Again, it goes against the thesis of hard money. The thesis of being decentralized, the Bitcoin maximalists got right. But with 20,000 crypto products, how are you supposed to choose? We have gold and silver, gold being, used for larger transactions, silver for everyday transactions. That's pretty easy for the last 5,000 years. They have an asset. I wouldn't even call it an asset. It's a Chuck E. Cheese token at best that people are speculating on. And that's where the value has been driven. And since Thanksgiving, it's gone from 69,000 to I don't even watch it anymore, but it's lost all its value and it's going lower. Governments are clamping down on it. India every day, just Google a hack of Bitcoin.
We've talked about precious metals. We've talked about bonds. We've inadvertently talked about equities and crypto as well. Talk to me for a moment, just before we wrap up, about property and the challenges that you see in the property market in the States in particular, given what we have seen in interest rates.
Interest rates, really, if you call that being tough and fighting inflation, I laugh when I read that they're being hawkish, because what can they do about the price of oil? What can interest rates do about the price of oil? The answer is absolutely nothing. What can interest rates do about shipping containers that are hanging out in China? And if people don't think that China is calling it a COVID or a zero policy of COVID, it's basically an economic war. Because there isn't a business in the United States that doesn't depend on supplies from China. So by choking that off, it's basically saying you're not going to have an economy. But back to property values, it's still a good buy if you can find a market, near farmland. You got to think, why is Bill Gates buying up all the farmland? That's pretty interesting. Or you want to be near resources. I wouldn't say buying property in Phoenix, Arizona is very smart, because if you look at Lake Mead and Lake Powell, or the hunger stones that you see on the Rhine in Germany, the whole southwest of the United States, with the exception of Denver, that's located near Newmont Gold's there, and Cripple Creek, and a lot of the gold and silver, and they have a lot of oil. But with the exception of California and Colorado and maybe Utah, the whole West is burning up. It's just, so you need to go near resources. Like Pittsburgh has 3 rivers. They got a lot of natural gas. They have coal. So if you can buy a home near resources, it's a smart buy, because today's interest rates are still under 6. That's fine. When they go, the Fed's I hate the word pivot, but they're going to go back to easy money or dovish or lower interest rates, because this whole system is based on debt. And there's no way for it's not based on growth. It's based on pushing the debt to the next generation. That's been that way since probably 1913 here. I don't know. I haven't studied European economics, but I know US economics. So property is still good because it's a hard asset.
To summarize then, John, bring it full circle here. When we talk about inflation, you're saying inflation is significantly higher than what's actually recorded. A lot higher than the 9-odd%, an awful lot higher than the shadow stats figures. The narrative, you totally agree with the idea of not believing the narrative, and the narrative that is being pushed. You're seeing the increase in state control in our lives, as evidenced by One of the examples you gave there is the 87,000 IRS, new IRS employees that have been hired with some, what was seen as questionable powers or questionable intentions. Monetary debasement is going to continue. The printing of money is going to continue. It is continuing with the new Inflationary Act. I can't remember the full name of it. It's the Inflation Reduction.
It's always the opposite. So because it's an Inflation Amplification Act,
yeah.
Edward Bernays, the nephew of Freud, would have said, as the public relations arm would say, no, call it the Inflation Reduction Act.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So monetary debasement, monetary printing is going to continue with the Inflation Reduction Act, and sound money, the pursuit of sound money, it continues. Gold and silver are going to have their day in the sun very soon.
In terms of utility.
In terms of utility.
And that's what you want. We don't watch the price action. Think of it as the utility.
What you can
interact with your community, but you have to be the agent of, instead of waiting around and being reactive, like wait till the government tells me that gold and silver money. It's not going to happen because they control the paper currency. They don't want you to use another currency like gold and silver. Yeah. So you have to trade outside of their system in what I'm calling our parallel universe.
Before we wrap up, can you tell our viewers where they can find out more about what it is that you do?
Sure. I'm a writer for an independent publication called The Pickaxe, thepickaxe.xyz. I don't use .com because it's too mainstream. And on Twitter, I'm at thepickaxe_AG.
Right.
So that's it. And I return all my emails or direct messages on Twitter is fine. And we have to grow our community. So the best way to do it is to, and don't be afraid to pick up the phone and talk to any of the people you like on, and don't listen to experts like any of the people on YouTube. Don't listen to me. Do your own research. And if you find that we're aligned on some values, then let's expand our community of people that want to trade outside mainstream financial repressive institutions. And it's really been my honor to be on your channel. I've seen the interaction, your engagement, and your guests, and I don't deserve to be included among them, but I do want to thank you, and I'm grateful for our time.
I disagree with that, but and it's been fantastic having you on here. Hopefully we can catch up again soon. But John Forrest Little, thanks for being on GoldCore TV today.
It's been my honor and pleasure. Thank you, Dave.
My thanks to John Forrest Little for joining us. It's always refreshing when we have new names on the channel. Very often the conclusion is the same, but the perspective and the approach can differ wildly from the usual suspects. And we think that it's crucial when you're starting to question how best to protect your wealth and livelihood from the disastrous decisions that are being made without your say-so. If you've enjoyed this interview, then please hit subscribe so that you know when we have our next guest on. As I mentioned to John, I've recently spoken to Jim Rogers, and we're bringing that interview to you very soon. Jim's interview will be previewed on our sister show, The M3 Report. This is the show that not only brings you great guest interviews, but also commentary from the GoldCore team and some brilliant chart analysis from friends of GoldCore TV. And if the summer heat has got you looking for something a little less deep dive, then why not check out our dinner party with Jim Rickards, Mark Faber, and David Morgan. As heavy on editing as it is on fun, this show shows the more personable side of these gold and silver market legends and asks the questions that you've perhaps always wanted to know the answer to. So, plenty there to keep you entertained and learning until we meet again. Thanks for joining me on GoldCore TV again, and until next time, goodbye.
You want to know how to be a successful investor? The answer is stay with what you know. Don't listen to me. Don't listen to TV people, internet people. Just stay with what you know. If I told you you can only have 20 investments in your life, you would be very careful. You wouldn't be jumping in and out, listening to hot tips every day, every month. You would stay with what you know, and you would become a successful investor. Everybody watching this knows a lot about something, whether it's fashion or cars or sports or something. When you see something that you know is going to be successful and exciting, Don't just say, oh, that's going to be great. Don't tell all you. Then you go and you do your research and you figure out how to, and if you should invest and how to invest, and then you invest. You will know it long before I will, or long before other people in the investment community. You will also know when to sell, because you will know when something's going to change again. Nobody likes to hear it. Everybody wants a hot tip. Everybody wants to be rich this month. In those days, we did nothing but focus and concentrate and dig deep and dig deep and dig deep.
Hi there, Greg